Blockheads, Happy New Year and welcome to week 1 of Blockheads 5 part 2. Our designer this week is Sherri McConnell of A Quilting Life, and she's designed a great block for us called Dream Big. This is my finished block. I love how it turned out, and so I can't wait to walk you through sewing this block together in this video. So why don't you go ahead and print out your pattern and pick out your fabrics and let's get sewing. Okay, let's start by taking a look at our pattern. Let's look at the different elements in this really nice block that Sherri has designed for us. So we're going to be making half square triangles, we're going to be making flying geese, and we're going to be making a square and a square unit. For that one, we'll use the stitch and flip method. We'll use the same methods we've been using all along for our flying geese and our half square triangles. We'll be doing 2 at a time half square triangles, and then we'll be doing 4 at a time no waste flying geese, and then like I mentioned, we'll be doing stitch and flip for this square and a square unit. Now I am going to do something different with my half square triangles. So in this method that we've been using, we have you draw a line from corner to corner on one of your squares, and then sew a 1/4 inch on either side of that line, and then cut apart on that line to make your 2 half square triangles. So these are going to be for my half square triangles. I'm going to go ahead and cut these on the diagonal first before I sew them. It's just easier for me. I find that I get a straighter seam when I do that. A lot of people don't like to do that because they don't want to deal with that bias edge, and I totally understand, but I don't have any problems with it. So you'll see when I start sewing my pieces, these are going to be cut in half already, and it just goes a lot faster for me. Okay, so I have all my pieces cut and ready to go. I have my 1.5 inch squares for A. These are my 2 inch squares for B and C that I've already cut in half on the diagonal and stacked together, so I can just chain piece them really quickly. Here is my 3.5 inch square D and my 2 1/8 inch squares E. And then I have my 3.5 inch square F and 2 1/8 inch squares G here. And then I have my 2.5 inch square H and my 1.5 inch squares I for my, so these are for the square and a square, or the economy block. These are my 2 flying geese, my half square triangles, and then just the plain squares for the corner units. So now we're ready to start sewing. Okay, the first step is to make our half square triangles. So I'm going to start with that. Now, as I mentioned before, I have gone ahead and cut my squares in half on the diagonal, and I just like to do that because it makes chain piecing so much faster. But again, that's just my preference. Not everyone likes to do that because this is, a bias edge that we're sewing against. So it's totally up to you. It's your preference, whatever you're comfortable with. Let's go ahead and sew these half square triangles. Now, just a reminder, I am using a scant 1/4 inch seam when I'm sewing. And I know there's a lot of questions about that. I know some folks have been like, I don't understand the scant 1/4 inch seam. And that's kind of been discussed in the group about how the scant 1/4 inch allows for different thicknesses of threads. It also, allows you a little bit of extra space for trimming down. So I definitely recommend using the scant 1/4 inch seam. It's just a thread's width over from your line. So here on my Juki, it's hard to see here, but it's the 7, it's March number 7 on my needle plate, and I've got my tape lined up there. And so when I line up my fabric, I can see that line. It's not covering the line. It's over just the tiniest bit. So that's how I get my 1/4 inch seam, scant 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so now I've got my half square triangles sewn. So I'm going to press these open and trim them to 1.5 inches because I am making 6 inch blocks only for my blockheads this year. So, or for this group. Okay, I've got my half square triangles here ready to trim. And I just wanted to show you how I have written the cutting instructions so that you have a little bit of extra room to trim down. I like to sew oversized and trim down, and so I have written the cutting instructions to allow you to do that. So these are going to be trimmed down to 1.5 inches. And you can see here's that 1/2 inch line right there. So I've got room all the way around to trim. So I'm going to trim these and then we'll be ready to assemble our corner units. I've got my 1/2 square triangles trimmed, so now it's time to assemble these corner units with the A squares and the 1/2 square triangle units. So I'm going to go ahead and just get all of my pieces put together, and that way I can chain piece just right along, the seam will be along this edge. And when I press them open, I'm gonna press towards the A square. So I'll end up pressing them open this way. All right, now I'll trim these, and like I said, I'm going to press open this way, and then I can assemble the corner units. Okay, I've pressed all my my little square and HST pairs to get open, and again I pressed towards the A square for all of them. So now when I put them together like this, that seam's gonna nest really nicely. Now we'll sew 2 units together to make 1 corner unit, and when I press these open, I'm gonna press the seam open, just making sure that seam nests. So you can see right there, it's going to nest together. And now we'll sew a scant 1/4 inch along this edge. Looks good. Okay, so I'm going to take these to the ironing board, and again I'm going to press this seam open to reduce some bulk. I like to trim my threads as I go, just to keep things kind of tidy, especially if I don't think I'm going to be trimming down any units. So I just want to trim away some of these excess threads. Okay, I pressed open my units here, so you can see, and I went ahead and took them over to my cutting table and trimmed them just the tiniest bit. They didn't need too much trimming at all, but I just tidied them up just a little bit. So now they measure 2.5 inches square, and these corner units are done. We're ready to put them aside and move on to the next step. Okay, now we're going to make our flying geese. So for the first set of flying geese, I've got my large D square and my smaller E squares. And we're going to use the no waste 4 at a time flying geese method. This is one that we have used in the first round of blockheads. So you have probably, if you did the first round of blockheads, you've probably already tried this out. This method is one that I kind of struggled with when I first started quilting. I had a really hard time. My flying geese always turned out too small. So I've done a couple things to help make sure that if you use this method and you're kind of new to quilting, that you're set up for success. The first thing is I've sized the components up just a little bit so you have a little bit of wiggle room. So you might end up trimming away a little bit more than you would than you'd expect for, you know, no waste flying geese. And then the other thing is I've written the instructions so that you use a scant 1/4 inch seam again. So that's all going to help you make sure that your flying geese are the right size. If you are still not quite a fan of this method, you can use stitch and flip. And Joanna Figueroa of Fig Tree and Company, she does her flying geese stitch and flip. So I'll put the measurements in the blog post if you wanted to switch to stitch and flip, and Joanna probably will have that as well on her blog. But I know not everyone is crazy about the no waste method, but I think it's a great skill builder. And so I definitely encourage you to try doing this method if you haven't done it before. So we're going to start by laying our E squares right side together with our D square, corner to corner, and we're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam. The instructions tell you to mark the squares. I don't, because I have my seam tape, but you're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam on either side of that middle from point to point. Okay, so let's do that, and then we'll trim them and press them out. Okay, so now I'm going to trim right down the middle, and I'll press these out, and we'll have the first part of our flying geese. So, okay, I have trimmed or cut my square in half and pressed out these triangles, and now I'm going to sew the other square to the opposite side here. So we'll repeat that scant 1/4 inch seam on either side of what would be a marked line from point to point, and this is going to yield 2 flying geese, and then this one will yield 2 flying geese, and that's how we'll get our 4 flying geese from 1 large square and 4 smaller squares. So let me sew these. Okay, now you can see when I trim here, I'll press this out, and there's my flying geese ready to trim. Here's a little something to help you know that you're in the right spot for sewing. So see where my my top square here, this point where it meets the triangle underneath is right there on that stitch line. So I know that I'm in a good spot. I'm scant 1/4 inch right here, and I'm going to have a nice straight line in that because it meets right there in that point. So this one's going to turn out really well. Okay, let me trim these and press the triangles out, and we'll be ready to trim the final flying geese. Okay, we're ready to trim our flying geese, and I wanted to show you again how you're going to have enough room to trim these down. So they are a little oversized. So there's going to be, even though it's called the no waste method, there's going to be a little bit more trimming down than maybe you might have expected. And again, that's because I chose to size up the fabric cutting just a little bit to give you a little bit of extra space. So here is my 1 inch by 2 inch finished block lac ruler, flying geese ruler, and you can see I've got a nice amount of excess around my ruler here that I'm going to trim away. So you can find charts that have slightly smaller sizes for the 4 at a time flying geese if this is too much waste for you. But if you're new to making flying geese with this method, I really recommend giving yourself that little bit of overage so that you can trim down. It just makes for a nice, precise flying geese unit when you're all done. So let's trim these up, and we'll be ready to move to the next step. Okay, we've made 4 flying geese. Time to repeat that process and make the next set of flying geese using our F and G fabrics. So let's do that. And just like we did in the last set of flying geese, I'm gonna sew the last 2 squares on these and finish up the flying geese for step 4. Okay, we're going to trim these up just like before, and then we'll be ready to sew our flying geese units together. Okay, so step 5 is to join our flying geese units together. So the DE unit will be on top with the point facing up, and the FG unit will be on the bottom with the point facing down. So I will line these up and sew these together, and then when I press these, I'm going to press that seam open. So let's go ahead and stitch these together. Awesome, so I'll take these over to the ironing board and I will press this seam, I'll press the seam open. Like that. Okay, I pressed open my flying geese units and went ahead and took these over to my cutting table and made sure that they measured 2.5 inches, which they do. I trimmed them just the tiniest little bit, just kind of cleaned up the edges a little bit, but these are ready to set aside and move on to the next step. Okay, now we're going to make our square and a square unit. So I've got my H square here and my 4 I squares. So for this, we're going to do stitch and flip. So you would mark a line from point to point on the back side of your I square, and then you're going to stitch on that drawn line. Now I'm going to stitch just like a thread width outside the line because I want to account for my fold. If I stitch right on that line, I'm going to end up coming in a little small. So if I were sewing on the line, I'd be right here on this red line, right? But I'm going to go just a smidge, just like a thread's width to the outside and stitch there. So you can see I'm just barely outside. And then that way, when I fold it back, I've got enough of this black fabric. If I had been right on the line, I'd probably be just a little bit short, right? So that's why I do that scant seam there. And I'm going to go ahead and just do this opposite corner, and then I'm going to just use my fabric shears and just snip these off and finger press and do the opposite sides. I'm not going to go to the ironing board for this until I'm done sewing all my corners on. So let's do the opposite side. Perfect. Now I'm gonna take my shears. I don't really need to use my rotary cutter for this. It's just a little bit, and I can just snip that off. I'm going to finger press out and sew the opposite corners on. Once again, I'll use my shears to just snip the seam allowance here. Awesome. Now I'll take it to the ironing board and I'll press it out and trim it to make sure it finishes at 2.5, or doesn't finish, sorry. I'll trim it to 2.5 inches, and that will finish at 2 inches. Okay, so we've got our corner HST units, our flying geese units, and our center square and a square unit. So we're ready to start assembling this block. So let's lay it all out and make sure we have all of the units facing the right direction before we start sewing the rows together. Be especially careful with your half square triangles. Make sure those are oriented in the right direction. There we go. So you want to make sure that a corner square, solid corner A square, is touching the flying geese for the center units. So, okay, when I sew these rows together, I'm going to press the seam towards my corner units for the top and bottom row. And then for my center row, I will press the seam towards that center unit so that when I join my rows together, those seams are all going to nest. When I join my HST units to my flying geese units, I'm just going to kind of eyeball that seam there. So here we've got the seam, towards the solid A square. So I can kind of see, it doesn't nest exactly, but it lines up. If you look right there, you can see it kind of lines up. And I want to make sure that they all kind of line up so that it looks even when I sew it together. All right, let's start sewing. Take this over to the ironing board, and I'm going to press the corner units, the seam for the corner units out, and the seam for the center unit in, like that. Okay, so I got over to the ironing board and I decided to press the center row seams open instead of towards the center unit like I'd said before. And that's why I don't always have pressing instructions in here for y'all, because it just kind of depends. I wasn't happy with how it looked pressing the seam towards the center unit. I felt like I was going to get a better result if I pressed that seam open. But maybe you would find that you would rather press it towards the outside and do something different. So, there's sometimes I'll put the pressing direction in there, but it's a lot of time it's just a recommendation. It's not set in stone, so you can choose to press in a different direction. So so I did end up still pressing the top and bottom row units towards those corner units, just like I had said, but that center one I decided to press open. So now I'm ready to just sew my rows together. And they won't, it won't nest, but it'll still line up really well, and then we'll be done with this block. So now I'm going to trim the joined threads here where I had kind of webbed my units and rows together, and I'm going to press open. I always press open my row seams. So we'll trim those threads and press it open and do a final trim of our block. Okay, I pressed my seams open and trimmed up my block to 6.5 inches, and so this is block 1 all finished. I went ahead and made my second version while I was at it. So I've got my sort of traditional scrappy fall version and my kind of cottagey Americana version. So that's this week's block. Thanks so much for sewing with me. Thank you, Sherri, for a great first block to kick off round 2 of Blockheads 5. And we'll be back with the next block next week.